Welcome to the Element Q podcast. I'm your host, TJ Woodward, and I'm thrilled to have you join us for this empowering journey. Each week, we shine a light on the authors, thought leaders, therapists, coaches, and healers of all types who are making a difference in the LGBTQ plus community. Together, we honor those who came before us, the courageous and resilient trailblazers who stood for our rights and recognition. Their strength laid the foundation we stand on today. Here, we celebrate their legacy by diving into the stories, insights, and tools that inspire gentleness, healing, and transformation. So get ready to be uplifted and empowered. This is the Element Q podcast. My guest on this episode is Dr. Patrick Lockwood. Patrick is a licensed clinical psychologist, a professor, and so much more. His full bio will be in the show notes. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Hey, TJ, thanks for letting me come hang out.
Yeah, I like that you're saying we're going to hang out, because the conversation we get to have today and we're going to hang out and have is within the LGBTQ plus community, body image and shame. We're talking about how we can create a place to have a deeper conversation about the healing that's required within our community. Knowing that we've been standing on the shoulders of those who have stood for and maybe even fought for our rights. And now it's a time for us to move into the conversation of healing. And this is a conversation that to me is really important. I know as a gay man growing up, having so much shame, and that led to me having a lot of shame about my body. So I know that you felt this would be a great topic to talk about, and I am ready to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I think you and I both probably have hours of things to say about this topic, given both our personal experiences and our professional experiences. So, I think we'll have some fun. And one thing that was really on my mind when we were talking about having this conversation is how this shows up in the professional world. Because, again, both you and I have extensive experience working in the substance use disorder and mental health treatment industry. And I think this is probably not too provocative a statement. I would say that both on the patient side, but also on the provider side, there seems to be an ongoing struggle with body image, especially in the LGBT community. And so I think it's important for kind of everyone to be part of this conversation, not just us professionals, but I think this literally applies to everyone, because it seems like, especially because we are sexual and gender minorities, we have a focus, an identity focus that does involve the body compared to other types of minorities. And so because of that, that bodily difference keeps us kind of constantly thinking about what we look like and how we present to the world. So there's concepts like internalized homophobia and things like that, which are more about self-perception and mind and mental states. But it also does have to relate to how we physically see ourselves in the world, right? I think there's a phrase that is used all the time in the online community and in real life, which is the phrase straight passing, which has been shot my direction a great many times in my life. Many people are shocked to know that I have a man of 12 years in my life, and would never have guessed because they just thought I'm some nerd or something like that. And so I think there's many different types of ways that body issues, body image issues, shame around the body correlate or tie to this internalized homophobia, this not being enough, not being masculine enough, and in many cases nowadays, not being feminine enough, because there's this counter reaction I think has happened in the last 35, 40 years in LGBT spaces, where it's like the person who can vogue the best and who can be the most effeminate and the most flamboyant and get the most attention on RuPaul's Drag Race, and many of these like cultural norms that aren't inherently bad, but there's a new orthodoxy in the opposite direction, where there was an overcompensation because of shame towards the overly masculine and on steroids and jacked and ripped and all these kinds of things. There's also the opposite that is idealized and devalued in our community. And all of it to me seems to have to do with the broader conversation around body image and internalized homophobia and shame around sex and sexuality and things like that.
Absolutely. And as you're talking, I'm just thinking about my own journey and shame being such a big part of my early life. from a very early age. And for me, it was interesting. It showed up first as misogyny directed toward me. Don't act like a girl, don't walk like a girl, don't talk like a girl, don't throw like a girl. Those are the messages I heard way before people were calling me derogatory names about being gay. That came very soon after. But the very early ones were like that of being a more masculine boy. And those messages are so pervasive. And in some ways, they're not even spoken, right? It's just a glance or a look or a feeling that I would get from like a man in my life or an adult of like, I remember my fifth grade teacher, just absolutely very, very homophobic and, would unbutton my shirt, like boys don't dress that way. Like there were all these messages that I received. And I think that shame that became not only a driver of my addiction, but also became a driver of my identity. And I think that's what you're speaking to. Because I felt so broken within, I wanted to look a certain way so that I could feel okay. And I think, there was an era where I was going to the gym to get the perfect body. There was an era where I was trying to be as thin as possible. There was an era where I was trying to be as masculine as possible. There were all these different eras, but at the root of it for me was shame. And in the work that we get to do, working with people, specifically within LGBTQ, but really with all people, shame is such a driving force, not only of the addiction in many cases, the mental health and well being, but also this idea of who am I and what perception I want to bring to the world and what's underneath that. You and I know, are passionate about moving beyond just the symptoms. The symptoms might be how I present, but the deeper stuff is the shame. That's the root of this. So how do we actually start to unpack this, look at it, and ultimately start to heal it?
Yeah, you and I are both very aligned philosophically when it comes to the focus on healing as opposed to the focus on being other or being different or bad or anything of that nature. I think, for people to really want to heal, they have to see pain, is usually my experience as a clinician and a treatment center operator. I think, you know, many people are not very invested in acknowledging how they feel. I think many people are not particularly either aware or interested in being aware because I think there are some sociocultural norms in the LGBT community that are about not being aware, like using a bunch of drugs or listening, dancing in loud music, dark, right? Like we're literally hiding from each other. Even though it's fun, it's literally a version of hiding. And so I would say that there's a spectrum of people who are more or less interested and more or less aware of how much internalized homophobia they have, shame around body, shame around masculinity, or shame around femininity. And so I think we would need to start talking about like how do we reach the people who are more aware and more interested, and the people who are more aware but less interested,
Mm.
and then the less aware, less interested but more aware. Like we want to talk about those in my mind, those different combinations of people. And partial that's built on my experience working in LGBT treatment too, because I worked with a lot of people who were very aware, but they weren't very motivated to deal with the shame around their body or internalized homophobia, masculinity, etc., because it worked for them, right? So that they could see that it was a problem and that it related to the ways in which they operated in the world that didn't help them. But if there's no real interest because either you are traditionally attractive and therefore you get attention and attention allows you to feel okay, it's hard to convince people that maybe getting all that attention is not that good for them, for instance.
Um,
Or
Wow.
the opposite. Or
Yeah.
maybe some people have invested in an identity as less than, and
Mm.
so they've identified with their shame. And so if you've identified with your shame and you have, to put it kind of colloquially, you have a chip on your shoulder and you feel like you need to have it there because it makes you feel powerful. Because for some people, shame leads to anger, which leads to feeling powerful. So you feel empowered as a victim or as someone full of shame. And so that person, I think, can be reached differently and be helped differently than the person who maybe has shame and internalized homophobia or issues around their body and masculinity or femininity, but likes it. Like
Yeah.
those are different people that I think need different approaches. I don't know if you would disagree or not.
Oh, I completely agree. And for me, like I was relating to, I was just literally thinking about so many different clients who I've worked with and also my own journey simultaneously and playing. I've been in both of those camps, right? I had such a great sense of shame or a belief in my brokenness. And at one point, the strategy to manage that, because my philosophy is we carry these core wounds, also known as core false beliefs, but they're really more of a vibration, right? I'm walking around feeling broken. And that sense of feeling broken is what creates the conditions of my life. And I'm either conscious of that or I'm unconscious of that. So during the unconscious period, I was like, I need to look a certain way so I don't have to feel this. And that's really the overly simplistic, but the ultimate truth. I don't want to feel this. It wasn't conscious. One way to do that is to dress a certain way or to have my body look a certain way or to be sexual in a certain way or not sexual in a certain way. Because for me, there's so much shame tied to sex. Because if you think about a person is either being told or at least has a felt sense that my own attraction to another human, be that a person of the same gender, opposite gender, all the different layers of that, or both, that we actually can have shame by just simply being a sexual being. And then
Mm-hmm.
I add to that, some men in my family who were hypersexual, and it was a scary thing to become a sexual being. I'm like, no,
Mm-hmm.
I had early experiences of sex that felt like so much shame. I remember after I would have sex going into a shame spiral. When you
Mm-hmm.
were talking about the pain that became the motivator,
Mm-hmm.
that as much as I would love to say people can heal and go on their journey at any moment, including this one, for many of us, for me and many of the clients who I've worked with, it got painful enough where I was like, this living from the outside in isn't really working. And then I had to look at the deeper part, which you
Mm-hmm.
so eloquently talked about. There was an identity of being broken that I didn't want to shed. There was
Mm-hmm.
something about believing that I was broken or different, that I was stuck in a loop of shame. But I was afraid to let go of that identity as well. We see that with religious trauma. We see that with homophobia. I mean, there's so many different ways we receive these messages. So I absolutely agree completely. So how are we now going to have a conversation about moving into the deeper healing for people? How do we start to heal this?
Yeah, I think there's a number of layers to this. So if it's how do we heal, I think, I'm as a clinician and as a professor, my thought process is always what are all the layers,
Mhm.
right? That's how I think because I don't think, people act in a simple way, but we're not built simply. And so, for the people who are part of different types of social organizations where maybe shame is normative, for instance, or use certain types of technology where shame is kind of like automatically on deck. So, just to pick on an easy target, there's always all the hookup apps in LGBT culture, like Grindr is probably the most famous or infamous version of this. And, you know, there's when objectification and the body are front and center in the socially normative sense, like on Grindr, right? Because Grindr, anyone who for some reason doesn't know what that is it's called a dating app, but it's really a hookup app, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And you're going to have to make the body front and center, which means that whatever your body image issues are, whether they're like more mild or they're more intense and shame driven and things like that, then you can't not deal with it. It has to be part of how you show up in that experience, right? Now, maybe you've learned to overcompensate, or maybe you've learned to hide or lie or or use drugs, whatever you've learned to do, you found a way to function differently in that circumstance. And so when I think about the different layers of a person who's dealing with body image issues in the LGBT community, I always think like, what are the individual level things we can address and talk about? Can we engage in therapy of some kind? Can we try conscious recovery? Are there various things we can do to look at the individual and take accountability for our behavior and address our core negative beliefs and to have open conversations about shame with someone you trust that's safe, like a clinician or a counselor, etc. But I don't think it ends with individual personal responsibility. I've been accused of being a conservative, but the truth is I'm actually not because as much as personal accountability is a big deal to me, that's 1/10 of the story because people can't just like pull themselves up out of their bootstraps when they're like actively being shot at, for instance. So like there are other layers outside of the individual that have to be addressed. And so I'm interested in having a conversation about the person's relationship to hookup apps. I'm interested in why they choose to hang out in certain areas with certain types of people. Do you hang out with other people who are full of shame and who use their shame around their body to overcompensate or undercompensate, for instance, right? Because like I think the body positivity movie is terrible. Movement, excuse me, is terrible. And the reason I think it's terrible is because it's the opposite direction. I feel so shamed about what I look like that I can be unhealthy, and that's totally okay. And those are my words, not yours. So I'll take full accountability for the whatever pushback you get. But like if you are invested in being as physically unattractive and unhealthy as possible because you're trying to live out your shame, which I see a lot in the so-called body positivity world, it's no better than the people who are over obsessed with what they look like, getting surgery, spending money on steroids, plastic, whatever, like thousands of dollars this direction or, decompensating health over here in the other direction are both equally problematic. And so, what's your social circle like? And why do you hang out with those people? And how are those relationships helping you and not helping you? Is another layer. Another layer beyond that is why do we have these various norms in our community? Like, why are we so prone to stereotypes
Yeah.
compared to people in the straight community? And why, and how does that serve us? Right? Right? Like, why do we need to talk to each other in this way? Why is someone a twink and a jock and a twunk and all these things, which is, again, it's fun, it's internet lingo, it's hookup app lingo, and that's totally fine. But when these labels become important to our identity in a way that don't seem to be important in the mainstream hetero community, I wonder what the message is and how these messages en masse are actually good or bad for us when it comes to bodily shame. So I
Well,
want to think about like the individual and the social circle and like the bigger systemic issues in our culture and how we have a conversation about all three of those layers because none of these things are all good or all bad. I don't think you have to look a certain type of way to be healthy. I don't, despite my comments about the so-called body positivity movement. I don't think that there's a one way to be attractive and there's one way to be healthy. I think when people go to these extremes to overcompensate or undercompensate, they're clearly acting out something, trauma, shame, whatever it is. And so, can we have a conversation about the fact that we try to live in these extremes and how not good for that community that is?
yeah, I love this because when we look at shame within the individual, starting there, we know that shame lives in secrecy, silence, and judgment. And that's the way Brene Brown puts it. But I resonate with those three words so deeply because
Sure.
I think that's what allows it to thrive. And I love that you're bringing into the conversation. There's the individual work that we do in healing the shame, and then there's the collective or community we work in healing the shame.
Yeah.
And if we're only identifying as a group of people who have been ostracized or marginalized, and if we take that as an identity and then fight outward for it, although that has a place, that's not actually healing the deeper shame. And this, Patrick, is where you and I first met and first became excited to be in conversations with one another, whether the camera's on or not, is that the deeper work of healing the shame systemically, and I'm speaking of within the community first, and then in the world or the global community second, is we can't be in the secrecy, silence, and judgment. So, what you said in the beginning that's so important is when we create something that becomes normative, it's normal for someone to look this way with steroids or the body positivity, or I'm a bear, therefore I look like this, or I'm a twink and a twunk and all the different things. We're missing the actual shame. And I think a lot of times what happens, and this isn't only in the LGBT community, but what happens collectively would be considered insane in the individual. right? So we're pretending in so many ways that that's not what's happening. And we do sometimes get pushback when we say things like, or I'll say I sometimes get pushback if I say something like, yeah, but all of this is symptomatic of something much deeper. And
Hmm.
you already said trauma and shame, right? Trauma and shame, and it's a response. We're not making that wrong. That's not the conversation. We want to be in curiosity. Like that has maybe served us to a point, either feeling better or not as bad, right? Because all the strategies that we use to manage shame is so that we don't have the felt sense of shame, right? So the hooking up or the shopping or the looking a certain way or changing our body, I remember in the 90s, it was like the piercings and the tattoos and anything I could do because I was afraid to feel this. And the deeper work individually, of course, is, as you said, a safe place to bring it into the light. The opposite of secrecy, silence, and shame is speaking our truth, bringing it out of the shadows, and having a safe place to be vulnerable. How do we do that as a community, right? I think a conversation like this is important as part of it. When we're all in a camp where we all must agree and have a certain party line, if you will, that we follow, and then figure out who the enemy is and externalize, that's a strategy for the shame, but it's not healing the shame.
No, I agree. And, it's true that there's a lot of infighting in the LGBT community. So, the gays are at odds with the trans and the trans are at odds with the lesbians and so on and so forth. And to me, that's very sad because, you know, if there is a so-called enemy, it's the people who want to marginalize us, and we should stop marginalizing each other, I think would be a good idea. Now, I also say that realizing that some of the things that I've said so far in this conversation with you are going to read very similarly to the greater community that's out there that does not like the overtly homophobic conservative types and so on and so forth. And I'm going to be very clear that this is a spectrum conversation. So to some degree, some people are very overly compensating with sex or overly compensating with looking good or plastic surgery or whatever it is. And then there's the opposite in the spectrum I talked about where they're overly compensating with their shame by like falling apart or not caring about their health and trying to identify with their sickness and things like that. That's a spectrum and there is no perfect way to look. And so some people are kind of more normal in our community and more typical. And they have some shame and some internalized homophobia and body image issues, but they live a pretty typical life. There are some people who um, have a non-traditional lifestyle, open relationships, so on and so forth, and they're not just overcompensating and they're not just living out their shame. There's an entire spectrum of people in our community. So I want to make it clear that I'm not engaging in black and white thinking. All the gays are sick and stupid and hypersexual. Like that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying for the groups of people that have more of the shame and the people who obviously like the blind person could identify that the person's overcompensating one direction or the other. That's the group of people that needs the most help. But like you're saying, our community in general needs to have more of these conversations openly. And I see people do this. One of my former interns is a very good looking young man named Michael Pizzullo who has these conversations on podcasts. So he's a clinician who's out there doing the same thing that you and I are doing. And I'm so proud of him. He's doing the right thing. He's talking about chemsex. He's talking about all those things. I used to run La Fuente. My former intern Rory now runs it with Manny, and they're doing a good job. They just had a podcast talking about these things too. So I see a lot of people who are doing their best to get the word out. So conversation's growing, and that's awesome. And so we get to be part of that too, which is super cool. We're part of an ecosystem of people who are having these conversations without fear and without shame, you know?
Yes, and that's the healing that, as we know, if again, if we look at the individual process, whether it be recovery or getting healthy, going to therapy, maybe going to into a spiritual practice, we first identify like there are things that I have not identified as the issue, and naming the issue is one of the first steps, if not the first step. For me, like, in my late teens, it was drugs and alcohol. And then in my early 20s into sobriety. It was dealing with some of the shame and the body issues. And
Hmm.
so being able to identify the issue is the first step. And I think it's important that we're having these conversations. And I really do also appreciate the insight that you brought to the infighting within, the community, because I've had people, for example, that don't want to have a conversation that's titled LGBTQ plus because there's such different communities in so many ways. And then there's people that are afraid to say things the wrong way. And, I know with my trans friends, I just have conversations like, is it okay if I ask questions that maybe I don't understand something? Oh, yes, please, let's do that. Right. And I think sometimes we're afraid to ask the questions or have the
Mm.
conversations for these reasons that in our current culture, we might get, you even said it, we both had the moment of like, oh, we might get pushback. What if that's okay? Right?
Hmm.
Like, let's have the pushback so we can have the conversations. And I think that's the biggest part of healing, is to start to bring all this to the surface, which is what we're doing with this podcast and so many others.
Absolutely. And I agree that I welcome pushback. You know me fairly well. I'm fairly disagreeable by temperament, so I love a fight. And the thing is, I'm going to fight with you for you, not against you. Right? So anyone who has an issue with anything I've said, I welcome any and all conversation because I think that what you'll find at the end of the conversation is we're actually on the same team. Right? So the only enemy in my mind is shame, pervasive internalized homophobia, delayed adolescence. Like those are the enemy. People are not the enemy. Right?
Such an important point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. This is a really amazing conversation. I mean, I always love being in conversation with you. I am wondering if there's anything else that's showing up for you that we haven't talked about yet that you want to, as we sort of move toward the end of our conversation, what else is left that you wanted to discuss in terms of shame, in terms of LGBTQ plus, body image?
Yeah, I think I want to reiterate the importance of actually taking care of your body, right? So that's not just going to the gym or getting conventionally attractive in the way that you believe you should be or whatever. Taking care of your body is part of your mental health, right? So for me, body image is not just about like body dysmorphia as a diagnosis or something like that. It's about when you really care about your body, things like sleep, things like water, things like working out and being active and eating food that's actually good for you and not garbage all the time. Like, that's what I think about when I think about body image. I don't think stereotypes and twinks and twonks like that crap is so, it's elementary school stuff that doesn't actually relate to who the person is. So when I think about your relationship with your body, and it is a relationship, like how are you nurturing that relationship? Because, like, I'll tell you, one of my greatest sins that I commit against my body is I just don't sleep enough. And now I rationalize it by saying I'm a workaholic and I'm a full-time professor and blah, 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 which is technically on paper true, but it's just a series of rationalizations to like excuse my bad behavior, right? And so I know my relationship with my body is not the best that it could be, and I need to keep doing better. So like I'm decent with the gym. I love the gym. It's fun. It's a place to hang out and play around and take care of myself and look better. I love food. I try to eat decent if I can. I brush my teeth. I try to sleep. I have an okay relationship with caffeine. I take vitamins. So I do a lot to take care of my body, right? So I'm not a hypocrite in the sense that like I'm perfect because obviously we both know I'm not perfect in almost any way, shape, or form, but I'm trying to do better. And so I think trying to do better is a great attitude because it's the one that's not perfectionistic and not ruled by shame. And I think when we have a well balanced idea of what a healthy body is, not just do you have abs or perfect hair or skin or some shit like that, but like, are you actually feeding yourself appropriately? Are you sleeping appropriately? Are you resting? Are you having fun? Are you playing? Are you doing the things that actually make you a balanced body? Right? Like, those are the things I think about for body image, not just like the superficial, what do I actually look like and why kind of thing. And I
Beautiful.
think having more of that conversation in our culture would be awesome too. Cause like I know tons of people in my queer community don't sleep for shit, and they're high and drunk all the time, and they don't drink enough water, and they work out too much, or they don't work out at all. And there's just all these extremes around like the basics that keep you sane as a person from the medical, physical health perspective too.
Yeah, and I think about perfectionism being a strategy for shame, and
Yeah.
it works to a degree until it doesn't, right? Until
Yeah.
I realize that the perfectionism isn't actually shifting the shame. And when we do the quote unquote deeper work, or however we frame that, we get to meet ourselves. I got to meet myself, and I get to continue to meet myself. I said I get to meet myself. There might be some information there. Yes, I do see different aspects of self that I get to make friends with. That is for sure. The part of me who wants to eat well, the part of me who wants to address the shame, and the part of me that's like, no, I'd rather just, let's drink some caffeine and go out and have some fun, right? So to integrate all of that and to normalize all of that and to realize that how we heal shame is through connection and
Hmm.
curiosity. You know, I,
Hmm.
I I swore to my husband Will I wouldn't keep using this, and I haven't in a while, but I like to say I'm studying to be a cop, curious, open, and present. And when I'm
Mm.
curious, open, and present with myself and my others, and these
Mm.
different aspects of self, and the shame,
Hmm.
and the vitality, and the internalized homophobia, and the internalized self-assuredness, and all of it has a place
Hmm.
to have conversations like this that actually do move into the healing. And what does healing mean, really? Healing is a return to our wholeness. We don't come in with these ideas that I need to look a certain way in order to be acceptable, or I'm different than you because of the person who I'm attracted to, or I'm different than you because my gender expression is different than you, or my religion, and all the things we get taught that at its core has a baseline of shame. And the baseline of shame keeps us stuck. I think of shame as swimming in oatmeal. That's just the best I can
Mm.
describe, because when I'm in that sense of shame, I feel like I'm doing all this work, but I'm not going anywhere, and I just feel
Hmm.
bogged down. So
Hmm.
taking a breath, finding safe places, having conversations like this. I think about having conversations with people who I perceive to be different than I am and asking them questions. You know, my dad and his wife who live in LA, Lower Alabama. I get to ask them questions about the perceived differences, and I get to know, the core of who and what each of us is. So, Patrick, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Your full bio will be in the notes and how to, connect with you. But are there any final words that you want to say?
No, just thanks for letting me come chat.
Well, thank you. And, I am already knowing that you will be invited back on the podcast, because I think there's so much more that we have to talk about. But I really appreciate. Thank you, everyone, for watching. And thank you, Dr. Patrick Lockwood. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Element Q podcast. It's an honor to walk this path of healing and transformation with you. Remember, the courage and resilience of those who came before us live on in each of us. Let's continue to carry their legacy forward as we support one another in creating a world filled with love, gentleness, and empowerment. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who needs to hear it. Together, we're building a brighter future, one story at a time. Until next time, I'm TJ Woodward, and this has been the Element Q podcast.